You can recite an argument from weeks ago almost exactly as it happened. The specific phrase that stung, the exact tone someone used, even the precise order the sentences came in. Meanwhile, 3 completely neutral conversations from that same day have already disappeared entirely, leaving no trace you can recall even if you try. This isn't simply because the argument was emotionally significant at the moment it happened. Plenty of emotionally significant moments fade with time. What's actually keeping this specific memory so vivid, so word-for-word precise, weeks or even months later, is something most explanations of emotional memory miss entirely. You're not just remembering the argument. You're actively, continuously rebuilding and reinforcing it every single time you replay it in your mind. And that process is fundamentally different from how memory normally fades. By the end of this video, you'll understand the specific mechanism that explains why mentally rehearsing an unpleasant conversation doesn't just recall the memory, it actively strengthens it. Why trying to process an argument by thinking about it repeatedly often backfires completely, and a concrete way to interrupt this cycle without simply suppressing how you feel. Stay until the end, because the last part explains why some arguments stay perfectly preserved for years while objectively more significant events from the same period fade considerably more. Let's start with a distinction that's essential here. There's a difference between a memory being strongly encoded at the moment it happens and a memory being actively reinforced afterward through repeated mental rehearsal. Most explanations of why emotional memories last focus entirely on the first process, the initial encoding strength at the moment of the event. But that explanation alone doesn't fully account for word-for-word precision persisting for months. Initial encoding, even when emotionally strong, still degrades over time, without reinforcement, the same way any memory naturally does. What keeps an argument frozen in near-perfect detail isn't simply how it was encoded once. It's what happens afterward. Here's the mechanism. Every time you mentally replay a conversation, running through what was said, what you should have said instead, how unfair a particular comment felt, your brain doesn't simply retrieve a static, unchanging recording. The act of retrieval itself triggers a process called reconsolidation, where the memory becomes temporarily malleable again and then gets restored, effectively refreshing and strengthening the neural pathways associated with it. This means mental rehearsal isn't a neutral act of recalling something already fixed in memory. It's an active process that measurably reinforces the memory's strength and detail each time it occurs. This explains the specific, frustrating pattern of arguments staying disturbingly precise for far longer than their initial emotional significance alone would predict. Each replay isn't simply revisiting an old memory. It's functioning as a fresh reinforcement event, similar in effect to relearning the same information repeatedly. An argument replayed mentally 20 or 30 times over several weeks has effectively received 20 or 30 separate reinforcement sessions. Far more cumulative reinforcement than a neutral conversation from the same day, which was likely never consciously revisited even once after it occurred. This connects directly to a well-documented psychological phenomenon, rumination, defined by researchers as repetitive, passive focus on the causes and consequences of distressing experiences without active progress toward resolution. Rumination feels subjectively like productive processing, like you're working through what happened, understanding it better, perhaps preparing for how to handle it differently next time. But research on rumination consistently shows that, rather than producing resolution, it primarily produces strengthening of the original emotional and memory content, without corresponding improvement in actual understanding or emotional recovery. You're not processing the argument toward closure. You're rehearsing it toward permanence. There's a second mechanism that compounds this specifically for distressing conversations rather than neutral ones: emotional rehearsal amplification. Each time you replay an upsetting conversation, you don't just reinforce the factual content, what was said in what order. You also re-experience, at least partially, the emotional activation that accompanied the original event. This emotional reactivation during replay further strengthens encoding through the same emotion memory consolidation mechanisms that make any emotionally charged moment more memorable in the first place. This creates a compounding cycle. The replay strengthens the memory. The renewed emotional activation strengthens it further, and the increasingly vivid, strengthened memory becomes correspondingly easier to involuntarily recall again later, making future replay more likely, not less. This is precisely why arguments with people who matter most to you tend to be replayed with the greatest frequency and consequently retained with the greatest precision. It's not that these arguments were inherently more dramatic or more emotionally intense at the moment they occurred, compared to disagreements with people whose opinion matters less. It's that the ongoing significance of the relationship creates much stronger motivation for continued rumination afterward, more frequent mental rehearsal, more reinforcement cycles, and ultimately, a far more durable, precise memory than the same intensity of conflict would produce with someone less significant to your life. There's a third layer worth naming directly, because it explains the specific frustration of feeling unable to simply stop thinking about something you genuinely want to forget. Ironic process theory, demonstrated through research by psychologist Daniel Wegner. Deliberately trying to suppress thoughts about something, consciously instructing yourself not to think about a specific argument, tends to paradoxically increase the frequency of intrusive thoughts about exactly that content. This happens because thought suppression requires actively monitoring for the unwanted thought in order to successfully avoid it, and that monitoring process itself keeps the thought repeatedly activated, even while you're attempting not to think about it. This explains why just stop thinking about it consistently fails as advice, and why genuinely trying hard to forget an argument often results in replaying it even more. So how do you actually interrupt this reinforcement cycle, given that both passive rumination and deliberate suppression tend to backfire? First, distinguish between genuine processing and unproductive rumination in real time. Genuine processing moves towards some form of resolution, understanding, or decision about next steps. Rumination repeats the same content without progressing toward any of these outcomes. When you notice yourself replaying conversation, ask specifically, is this replay generating new understanding or a concrete next step, or is it simply repeating the same content again? If it's the latter, recognize this specifically as reinforcement, not processing. Second, deliberately limit replay through scheduled processing rather than attempting full suppression. Research on worry and rumination shows that designating a specific, brief window of time to consciously think through a distressing event, rather than either ruminating freely throughout the day or trying to suppress all thoughts about it, reduces both the total reinforcement volume and the ironic rebound effect that pure suppression tends to produce. Third, introduce a deliberate interruption technique the moment you notice replay beginning outside its designated window, a specific, engaging alternative mental or physical activity that requires enough attention to break the rehearsal cycle. This works specifically because it addresses the reinforcement mechanism directly, reducing the number of replay-driven strengthening events, rather than attempting the more difficult and often counterproductive task of actively suppressing the memory's content altogether. Fourth, if a specific argument is being ruminated on because it remains genuinely unresolved, address the actual unresolved element directly, through conversation or a concrete decision, rather than continuing to process it solely through internal replay. Since rumination is partly driven by the brain's attempt to resolve an open issue, providing genuine resolution, even imperfect or partial, often reduces the underlying motivation for continued mental rehearsal far more effectively than any purely internal technique can. Here's what ties this together. That argument isn't burned into your memory simply because it happened. It's burned into your memory because you've replayed it, consciously or not, dozens of times since. And each replay has functioned as an active reinforcement event, strengthening both the factual detail and the emotional charge a little further. The neutral conversations from that same day weren't inherently more forgettable. They simply never received the repeated rehearsal that turned one specific conversation into something approaching permanent. Understanding that distinction changes the actual target. It was never really about the argument itself. It's about the replay. If this explains something you've experienced, tell us in the comments about a conversation you can still recite almost word for word, weeks or months after it happened. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden mechanics behind your own mind, the next video is right there, waiting for you.